Hey everybody, it's been a very long past several weeks, and I'm finally getting back in the swing of making videos with this multi-game MTO, where I talk about a bunch of different games that I don't really have all that much to say about individually, so I bundle them all into one video. And in this particular case, we've got another fistful of first-person shooters. So in this particular video, I'll be taking a look at BPM, bullets per minute, Crossbow, Bloodnight, Dead Effect, Morphite, and Sanctum 2. And while I'm going to go ahead and get things started with BPM, I wanted to go ahead and mention that it has a lot of very bright flashing lights in it that may cause problems for you if you're epileptic or otherwise photosensitive. So I very highly recommend that if you have issues with photosensitivity to go ahead and skip BPM and move on to a different game in this video, or just stop watching the video entirely. I will of course have time codes in the video description box, as well as the pinned comment where you can quickly and easily move between the various games, and the time code you can go to manually if you need to in order to get past BPM will be displayed on screen right now. So if you have issues with photosensitivity, then consider yourself warned on that, and I'm going to go ahead and get things started talking about BPM. BPM Bullets Per Minute was developed by Awe Interactive and released in September of 2020, and it is a fairly interesting game, at least conceptually, because it is a rhythm-based first-person shooter, which probably sounds fairly weird, and it is. There is definitely an adjustment period to the general mechanical style of this, because it is more or less an arena-style first-person shooter, with all of the levels being generated procedurally, which means that you're basically just going to end up with a bunch of boxes with enemies in them, and you're having to jump and dodge around the enemies as they throw their attacks at you, and all the while are having to shoot enemies to the beat. But it's not just shooting to the beat, you also have to reload to the beat, and reloads take multiple presses of the reload button to finish that animation, so you ultimately are trying to get into a smooth rhythm of shooting, reloading, jumping, dodging, etc. That's all certainly a very neat idea, and it actually works relatively well. It's just that the game is ultimately ruined by a few things. The first of them is the graphical style they've gone with, which is certainly fairly striking, but unfortunately there are a lot of bright flashing lights as part of it that will definitely be a problem for people who are epileptic, which is why I put up a warning before this particular game. And the sheer amount of particle effects and filters they put over everything make it actually fairly difficult to see what you're doing sometimes. But while those are rough enough, the main problem with the game is actually just that it's a roguelike. So you go on a run and you just get the one life and that's it. Once you die, you have to restart the entire game all over again. You do unlock things over time, like new characters, and you can also gradually improve the capabilities of the shops and such. But mechanically, you'll be starting from square one every single time, and that just gets really tedious after a while. It's the same problem I have with basically any roguelike I've ever played, so it's not exactly all that unusual. But it's a real shame seeing a game like this where there's some degree of skill involved with the actual mechanics just being reduced down to RNG-a-thon. You'll quickly become bored with the very bland level design where basically every single level is just a bunch of boxes that have enemies in them. And ultimately the interesting mechanics and the actually pretty good soundtrack are just ultimately wasted on the whole effort. Again, it's just a real shame to see that. Maybe this concept can actually work better in a game that is much more tightly designed. I guess we'll just have to wait and see what happens when Metal Hellsinger comes out, because it's a pretty similar idea with the whole rhythm-based first-person shooter thing, but unlike this, it's not a procedurally generated roguelike. It's an actual campaign-driven first-person shooter, so we'll just have to wait and see how that goes. But if you're willing to put up with the roguelite stuff, then maybe you can get something out of BPM. I certainly didn't get much out of it because I really can't stand roguelikes, but of course your mileage is going to vary on that. Next up we have Crossbow Bloodnight, developed by Hyperstrange and released in September of 2020, and it's a very, very simple game. You have a crossbow. It has two fire modes, a rapid fire mode and a heavy mode where you launch a single projectile that does quite a lot of damage and also has an area effect on the impact site. And then there is your ultimate ability of sorts, where over time it will charge up, and once it's fully charged up, you'll send down spears of light that will just annihilate basically anything that's in their path. There's no story to it, it's just a single arena with enemies constantly spawning in, and you're just trying to defeat as many of them as possible in order to get as high of a score as possible. It's pretty similar to Devil Daggers in that regard, and in fact, if you liked Devil Daggers, you'll probably like Crossbow Bloodnight. I didn't really care for Devil Daggers, and I certainly don't care for Crossbow Bloodnight. I really need more out of my first-person shooters than literally just a single arena where enemies constantly spawn in. Obviously, your mileage is going to vary on this one, but I got bored of it in less than 20 minutes, and I really don't see myself going back to it. And I certainly can't personally recommend it as a result. Next up, we have Dead Effect, a first-person shooter by Badfly Interactive that was released in December of 2014 for PC, and it is actually a port of a mobile game, which of course explains the slightly crappy interface and the generally fairly low production values, but those aren't necessarily deal breakers, of course. They're mild annoyances at worst, and as far as mobile ports to PC go, you could actually do quite a lot worse than this. I mean, it even has an FOV slider, although unfortunately it only goes up to 90 degrees. At least it has one, though, and at least it has relatively decent graphics options, and it runs fine, so that's more than you can say for a fair amount of mobile ports out there. At any rate, Dead Effect itself is actually a rather simple and straightforward game. It's a zombie first-person shooter. You go through a bunch of corridors and occasionally a slightly more open area, and you mow down any zombie that gets in your way. There are a few different types of zombies that have different abilities, and you have a selection of weapons that you'll get as you continue to progress through the game, and those weapons can be upgraded in between levels. You do get a couple of special abilities, one of which is bullet time and one of which is an area effect attack, but other than that, there's really not a whole lot to this game. It's a pretty mindless zombie shooter, and if that's your kind of thing, then you might be able to get something out of it. But I get next to nothing out of zombie games, so this one ended up boring me very quickly, and I can't personally recommend it as a result. From what I've seen and heard, the sequel, Dead Effect 2, is a considerably better game, but I really don't have any interest in picking up the sequel, because, again, it's a zombie game, so maybe if you're interested in zombie games, then maybe take a look at the sequel, but as for this one, there's not really much reason to bother with it. Next up, we have Morphite, which is described as a casual, atmospheric first-person shooter inspired by the classics. I'm not entirely sure what that actually means, because if it's inspired by the classics of the first-person shooter genre, then it's doing a pretty bad job of being inspired by them because it's basically nothing like them. Therefore, I have to assume that inspired by the classics refers to something completely different, but that's beside the point. The simple fact of the matter is that whatever aspirations Morphite has, they're ultimately wasted on a game that has numerous technical issues, as reported by many people, although I didn't make it far into the game enough to really run into those, as well as a sickeningly low FOV, and keys that cannot be rebound, even though there's a rebind menu in the game, or at least there's supposed to be. When you go into the menu and use the key that it tells you to press in order to remap your keys, nothing happens. So not only is the game glitchy, but it also lacks basic functionality that you would expect on any PC game, whether it's indie or AAA or AA or whatever, and on top of that, it's just a ridiculously boring game. From what little I played of the game before I ultimately gave up on it thanks to that FOV just making me nauseous, basically all I was doing was wandering around and scanning things. I barely ran into any enemies, and the ones I did run into posed very little threat at all, and the combat itself had basically no impact behind it, so it wasn't remotely satisfying. And between the generally dull gameplay and that sickeningly low FOV, I just decided that it was better off if I just stopped playing entirely and went ahead and advised that you avoid it entirely. And funnily enough, when I looked at the Steam achievements, I wasn't remotely surprised. 90.1% of players of Morphite have completed the training mission. 43.9% of players have completed the next achievement, which is scanning 25 plants. And 42.4% of players have acquired their first weapon, aside from the basic plasma pistol you start with. And I can go on. Only 35.6% of players have survived a space combat encounter, and only 28% of players have beaten the first boss of the game. And while I know that Steam achievements are not going to be super accurate data on just how severe the drop-off of players with this thing is, you can still get a general idea of at least how much people are sticking with the game, and with a drop-off that severe, it's pretty painfully obvious that most people give up on the game in roughly the same amount of time I did, which was about 30 minutes. Obviously, there's more to it than just the Steam achievements and such like that, but I'm just talking about a general trend here, what I'm observing, and the reasonable conclusions you can make from that information. Obviously, if you can put up with sickeningly low FOVs and the inability to rebind your keys, which must really suck if you're on an AZERTY keyboard, but that's beside the point, then maybe you can find something to like about Morphite. But since the game doesn't even really function on a basic software level properly, then I can't remotely recommend it to anybody, so take that for what it's worth. And last for this particular video is Sanctum 2, a first-person shooter and tower defense hybrid that is, of course, the sequel to Sanctum, and it was developed by Coffee Stain Studios and released in May of 2013 to a generally rather positive reception. Now, those of you who've been with the channel for quite a while may remember that I made a review of the original Sanctum about a decade ago now, actually. And while that review's quality is not remotely up to my modern standards, honestly, I have no interest in reduxing it because the original Sanctum was pretty boring, and I had absolutely no fun with it whatsoever, because, let's face it, tower defense and first-person shooter really don't go together very well at all. In a tower defense game, which is inherently a really boring kind of game, you just set a bunch of defenses and you try to organize them in such a way to where they will cause the enemies to go on a specific path through all of the various traps and towers that you've set, and they'll eventually eliminate all of those enemies. All adding first-person shooter mechanics to the mix does is make it so that you can actually do something other than simply hoping your towers are enough to take out all of the enemies. As far as the first-person shooting mechanics go, they're really quite simplistic. You have a primary weapon that's dictated by which character you're playing. It's either going to be an assault rifle, a shotgun, a sniper rifle, or a rocket launcher. And then you have a secondary weapon slot that you can select a weapon that you've unlocked to put in. And unlike in a lot of other first-person shooters, you have infinite ammunition, but you do have to reload. So after you've expended all the rounds in your magazine, then it will go into a reload sequence, and at that point you can switch over to whatever other weapon you're carrying and continue fighting the enemies until that, of course, runs dry. Then it'll go into its reload sequence, you can swap back to your other weapon, so on and so forth. That's pretty much it as far as the actual first-person shooter mechanics go, however. You just walk around, you can jump, you can sprint, and you can shoot at things. And that's about it. There are no special abilities or super weapons or power-ups or anything like that, and the only nuance to the shooting mechanics is that enemies have big glowing weak spots, which was a fairly normal thing when this game came out, and if you aim for the weak spot, then it will do a lot more damage than if you were just shooting them in some other place. Enemies will just route through whatever your tower maze is set up to be, unless of course they are flying enemies or bosses, in which case they have slightly different movement patterns. If they're flying enemies, they will actually go directly towards you or try to fly around your obstacles, and you'll end up taking them out pretty quickly because they're usually not that tough. And in the case of the bosses, they will just start smashing through all of your defenses, and you'll end up having to take them down yourself, more likely than not. I only played this in single player, and I got bored very quickly. It is set up to where you can play it with up to 4-player co-op, but I really don't see that appealing to people for very long. This is, again, a very simplistic game. It is really more of a tower defense game than it is a first-person shooter, and it doesn't really do either of those things particularly well. Of course, I'm not entirely sure that tower defense can actually be done well, because the inherent nature of the genre is extremely boring, and I have absolutely no idea why anybody found anything remotely enjoyable about it. I will say that it is definitely a better game than its predecessor, although it doesn't actually run all that well. I mean, keep in mind, I'm running an i7 4790K, 16 gigs of RAM, and a GTX 1080, and this game is still not maintaining 60 frames per second at all times like it should. There are just some oddities with the optimization and just issues with the engine in general, because this was still running on Unreal Engine 3. And so while it is certainly very playable as far as its frame rates go, it does have some oddities that are just annoying. They're not, of course, deal-breaking. What's deal-breaking is just the fact that the game is so boring. But issues like spotty performance really don't help. So while you can certainly say that Sanctum 2 is the best tower defense and first-person shooter hybrid, that really doesn't count for much, and as such, I really can't recommend this game at all. And that about wraps up this particular My Thoughts on video. If you have any further questions, feel free to leave those in the comments, and I'll try to respond to them when I can. Thank you all very much for watching, and thank you all very much for putting up with the lack of videos over the past several weeks, as you might have guessed from the posts that I made both on Twitter and on YouTube. The past several weeks have been an absolute mess. I had a medical issue come up that is dealt with now, but at the time it came up, it demolished my plans for the next couple of days. And then after that, a family issue came up, and we've been dealing with that for a while now, so I'm not exactly sure when that will be fully resolved. But suffice to say, all of that takes precedence over anything I'm working on the channel. So if there do happen to be any further delays or anything, I will certainly let you know on Twitter, and if I need to, I will go ahead and let you know on YouTube as well through the community tab there. But I'll likely only post there if there ends up being a longer delay than just a couple of days at most, or maybe even up to about a week or so. So I very much appreciate your patience while I've been dealing with all of this, and I appreciate your patience with the lack of videos over the past several weeks. Thank you all again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.